Hello and welcome to the first episode of our new podcast, the Talk Africa Plus. And today we are taking you to the skies to explore the state and future of aviation in Africa, an industry that connects economies, drives tourism, and shapes continental integration. I'm joined, of course, in this episode by senior editor Douglas Okwach and business producer Zawadi Mudibo. Gentlemen, welcome to the first episode, the very first episode of Talk Africa Plus, and quite an interesting topic we have, right?
Thank you, Jerry. Pleasure to be here.
Nice. Mudibo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
We really want your business mind here.
Yeah.
As part of the team that really, prepares the notes, prepares the shows of the business segment, that's global business for CGTN Africa. We're glad to have you here. And of course, you're going to talk so much about the African airlines and the situation that is aviation in Africa. But I'm just going to start with you, Douglas. You are dispatching a team, I think, in a couple of days to Nigeria. And of course, you are also very well traveled across Africa and even beyond the continent. I just wanted to give us, as we even begin, a comparison of air travel around Africa and outside the continent.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. Very interesting question, that comparison. I don't know whether it's possible to make a real comparison because connectivity within Africa is not the same as Africa connecting with the outside world. African countries connecting amongst themselves is a big challenge, and it has got to do with many issues. But before I go into those issues, one of the things that happens, because this team originates from Nairobi, which is in East Africa, and Nigeria is in West Africa, that makes the travel even more complicated. It gets worse if it is North Africa. So sometimes it is likely that if you want to go to West Africa, you could end up either in the Middle East or in Europe before you connect to either North Africa or West Africa. Occasionally, if you are lucky enough, you could get a direct flight to Lagos or to one of those West African capitals, but that is very rare. Now, the only airlines that do that are supposed to be local national airlines. So there's really no comparison. However, when you are traveling abroad from Africa, it's much easier, depending again on which airlines you use. For example, if you are traveling Nairobi Heathrow and you board KQ, you are likely to go direct to Heathrow. However, if you use the Middle Eastern airlines like Qatar or Emirates, or Etihad, you are likely to end up either in Dubai, in Doha, before you connect to the European capitals. So that is how complex it is. Now, if also you are traveling using Ethiopian Airlines, and you want to go to a European destination or a West African destination, and you are originating from Nairobi, you are likely to first of all end up in Addis before you connect to either West Africa or North Africa. So that's how complicated it is.
That sounds really complicated, but then I'm also looking at it from the other side. Of course, if you're someone who's not really well-traveled, especially when you're using flights around Africa and even beyond, sometimes it might be very thrilling for you to even leave the continent. For someone who's never left the continent, if you're going to Nigeria and you find yourself somewhere in Europe, of course, you'll feel like it's a good opportunity to actually feel Europe, even if it's just for an hour or two.
Yeah, of course. I don't think it's interesting. It's not very exciting if, for example, you end up in an airport like Charles de Gaulle, which is a very large airport, or you end up in Dubai, and your initial intention was just to get into a flight from Nairobi to, say, Lagos or Abidjan. Then you end up in some large European airport like Charles de Gaulle. It can be very distressing at times because it's not just about the layover time, but also sometimes connecting, finding the right terminal. It can be very complicated.
And I think that complexity of airlines and their routes within Africa and even beyond could, in a way, I suspect, also lead to the kind of costs that we see are associated with flying around Africa. Zawadi, the Talk Africa show that we had over the weekend focused on this very topic, and part of the discussions really surrounded the aspect of cost of flying around Africa. And you look at the comparisons that were given there, and you find that flying within Africa is on average 45% more expensive than similar flights outside the continent. From your perspective, and of course looking at the business angles, and of course some of the other aspects that could be involved in the whole topic of aviation in Africa, what would you say then this is down to?
Yeah, so then thank you, Jerry. So I'll just talk to you about the 2 points that you highlight. The first one, you have talked about why it's close to 50% more expensive. This is, there are 3 reasons in my view, 3 key reasons, possibly 4. One of them is that, and this the African Airlines Association has raised concern severally about. There is no common policy in terms of the air navigation services across Africa. The other issue is the issue around taxes, which do play a very pivotal role in making the cost of flights to and within Africa to be out of reach of many travelers. And then you have issues around the supply chain pressures. So we are looking at an International Air Transport Association or IATA report, which suggests that aircrafts in Africa are really on average 5 years or more, older than the global average. Now, what this means is for an older aircraft, then you consume more fuel and require more frequent maintenance. Parts sourcing is also costly for older aircrafts, and this is subject to long times of lead times, reducing what you call the utilization and increasing downtime. And then also the issues around airport levies. These are such as the landing levies, noise pollution, parking. We have what we call the common user terminal equipment, the jetway charge, the passenger bus. Every time you get into an airport and you have to be, moved to your checkout zone. So these are just some of the issues. And then the other bit you speak about is, we talked about just about 4 or 5, countries that allow for free visa travel within the continent. So first of all, I think what we need to understand is what is visa openness. This is really what I would say the extent to which in the case of Africa, African countries are open to visitors from other African economies. And then secondly, you look at issues around visa-free access. Countries that I think do currently allow that are Seychelles, Mozambique, Rwanda, Comoros, and Madagascar. So these are 5 countries only. Now, visas represent a very high cost in terms of the money per individual or institution that you need to pay to get approval or to get that green light to be able to travel. There's also the issue about the time you take or whenever you're applying for those visas. And then there's also the other complication around the ability for these countries to be open to travel, to tourism. If you have visa restrictions, then it means you're also limiting how frequently and how many people you can have within your country at a time.
And that's not to forget also the times.
Now, Jerry, if you allow me, let me just weigh in on what Zawadi has just said. First of all, what is really this idea of being taxed out of the air? Because the law of comparative advantage says that just do what you are good at and let others do what they are good at. So are we really good at, as Africans and African airlines, existing or prospective, are we really good at operating airlines, national airlines? Now, if we are not good at operating national airlines, which means it is not our comparative advantage, why then don't we just let those who can do it better, say like Ethiopian Airlines, or upcoming Rwanda, or Kenya Airways as we used to know it? Why can't we let them do it and we just pay for the services? I'm very curious about that question. And then I'm also concerned about African airlines using old aircraft. And I understand that some of their fleets, they operate some of the oldest fleets. And I understand the policy really that what the trend elsewhere is that aircraft is leased. So why do we want to own instead of leasing? And I think there are dynamics there which I don't know whether Mudibo can unpack, but I'm curious about being sentimental about things that are business, like owning a national airline when it is really not your strength. Is this about sovereignty? What is it really about?
It's interesting, even as you mentioned the countries that own national carriers, you actually struggle to even get to 5 national carriers that are actually performing well. You have mentioned Ethiopian Airlines, you have mentioned Rwanda, and when you come to Kenya Airways, you say as it used to be, because it's actually struggling now. But of course, Zawadi puts it very well. There's a lot of cost that is involved. And I agree with you. There's a lot of cost that is involved in running an airline. And some of these national airlines in Africa particularly might want to, as you put it, own aircrafts instead of leasing aircrafts. And that is one topic that came out very clearly in the Talk Africa show over the weekend. Our analysts were of the idea that, or rather of the opinion that it is much better to actually lease the aircraft than own it, because now the costs that are involved in owning this aircraft, even after you purchase it, are very, very high. But Zawadi, just take us through this. I'm going to, pick your brain a lot on this topic. Of course, I want you to put some perspective to us. Even as you do that, with all these limitations that the African airlines have, of course, I want to just take that into considerations as well. The vulnerabilities that African airlines have in terms of the operations that they have on the continent and even beyond. How can we get to solve that then?
So Douglas talked about the pride, which is interesting because Kenya Airways calls itself the pride of Africa. It's about...
Is it the pride of Africa as we speak right now?
That is the aspiration. For airlines to be profitable, they need to be able to fly frequently. Just take the common example of public service vehicles in any African city. They are cheaper than ride-hailing apps. If you want to use the Ubers and Bolts of this world, it's cheaper, and the reason is their volumes. So you have a 50-seater bus carrying people in a direction, and you're paying them. They are paying as little as $1 for a trip in one direction, and they have several trips across the day. And then it makes economic sense at the end of the month to run that bus service. On the other side, the issues around the airline and what makes it very difficult for African airlines is most institutions or institutions that govern air travel and governments within the continent tend to overtax air services, assuming that when you overtax or when you tax, then you're making money. But then it makes it prohibitive for those who want to fly, particularly domestic flights. For example, if I can take a ride from Johannesburg to Cape Town, I could take maybe a whole day or 12 hours to do a drive. But it's scenic, it's enjoyable, and I will spend less than I will need to if I have to fly. So these are the things that most air services operators do not put in place. And then there's also the issue around, and maybe this is where we need to speak a little bit about the single African air transport market, the SAATM. Which is part of what is called the African Union Agenda 2063. It's a project that seeks to enable, or the aspiration is to have connectivity through a single liberalized air transport market across Africa. But then every jurisdiction, and that means every state or every country, has its own requirements. So you have to pay. I talked about at the beginning, I talked about what is called the common policy in terms of the air navigation services. So you'll find that different countries will charge differently for those air traffic control services, communication, navigation, surveillance, and aeronautical information services. This is supposed to be standardized. If I'm paying, let's just give a figure of $100 flying into the Kenyan airspace, why should I pay $300 if I'm flying into the DR Congo airspace? These are the things that make travel across Africa very expensive. So unless the levies are harmonized and brought to the very minimum, then it's going to be very difficult for any of these services to be meaningful. And then if you look at in 2018, which is when the single air transport market was unveiled, at least 38 African countries participated, and that represented around 89% of intra-Africa air travel. But of course, the downside is, as we speak, only 23 out of the 54 African Union member states have signed a memorandum to implement or to remove any bilateral air services agreement restrictions which are not in compliance with the Yamoussoukro Declaration. So this is where the problem lies, that you have a policy that you need to get traction around, you need to lobby the whole continent to agree to. They will agree, but they will not implement. So it will not be ratified. And unless it is ratified, then it's almost impossible to have this come into fruition. We've talked about, for example, the free African market access, the AFCFTA. You cannot have a free market access within the continent if you cannot travel freely. A couple of months and I think a year or so ago, Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, once said he requires over 34 visas to travel within the continent. And it's frustrating. That is a man who will sit down and say, okay, I want to invest in Kenya, I want to invest in Ethiopia. And then he has to go through days and weeks of visa applications and applying. That is lost opportunity, that's lost business, and that is lost money. So what really has to be addressed is the political will within the African continent. It is one thing to say we want a free market, and it is another to actually ratify the policies that you agree on.
And as you're putting it, so then, if I understand you correctly, this goes even beyond aviation, because if you're going to get connectivity, you're not looking for connectivity just for flights. Right. So you have mentioned the AFCFTA. These countries have to sit down and agree. Of course, this is something that an agreement is in place, but ratification has not happened. And it's going so many years now. And it still remains, of course, an opportunity that the continent is losing in terms of business, in terms of just connectivity between different populations, different citizenry. And then there are also, of course, other things that are going to come into play. And if I can just probably just take some information from IATA, in a recent report that they released, I think, towards the end of 2025, they did mention that African airlines continue to operate in one of the most difficult environments. And some of the constraints that they were including in that report include low GDP per capita, which then limits demand and raises price sensitivity. And then you also have high operating costs that are in comparison to other airlines outside the continent. So you find that African airlines will pay up to more than 17% higher in terms of acquiring the fuel that they use. The taxes that, as you're mentioning there, the taxes are so high, on average 12 to 15% higher than other regions. And air navigation charges, which both of you have actually been bringing up, is also captured there. 10% more than other regions if you're going to look at that comparison. And then there's also limited connectivity. The report captures that only 19% of intra-African routes have direct flights. And as you're mentioning at the beginning, Douglas, that means the chances of you coming direct from Kenya to, let's say, Morocco are very limited because you're going to be rerouted somewhere. You're going to, the chances are so high, you might find yourself going to another country. And I want to give a personal experience here. I once traveled to Nigeria from Nairobi, and we had to make 2 stops, one in Kigali, where I remember we did change an aircraft, and then the next stop was in Yaoundé before we went to Abuja. And one of my colleagues as well here at CGTN Africa also made an interesting trip because they're going to Cape Verde. And you mentioned sometimes you might even leave the continent. They actually left the continent. They had to go all the way to Lisbon before now finding another aircraft, another flight that now brought them back into the continent to Cape Verde. And in Lisbon, they actually spent more than 12 hours. And you can imagine how much that can inconvenience someone. And Zawadi puts it very, very interestingly. This is lost opportunity. If you're a business person, if you're someone who's coming here as a tourist, you look at this inconvenience and you might actually opt out of, going through all this. But what is really interesting is, of course, these problems that we are mentioning here are well known. What is really stopping Africa from, addressing this? Zawadi says political goodwill. Is it just political goodwill?
Thanks. This is very interesting because, first of all, when the African Union, which is the multilateral entity that runs African affairs, makes policy, who sits around the table? I'm really curious about that. Is it just the African Union Commission bureaucracy, or which is really just a bureaucracy because these are technocrats, or is it African Union bureaucracy in concert together with the African political establishment, which is really the countries and their leaders? The issue here is, these policies we make, like common market for air travel or visa policies. If everybody is around the table, it's stakeholder driven, everybody's input is in the policy document, then why then do we still need political will? Why are African countries reluctant, if they were participants in the making of these policies, why are they reluctant to ratify and domesticate these policies so that we can move forward? Because we see that in all aspects of these African policies, the question of political will, whether it is payment of membership fees, the simple act of paying membership fees, when we want to fund the African Union itself, there are always challenges. So that's a real concern, because I think if these protocols, these policies are developed through a stakeholder-driven process, then there should be no problem African countries implementing them. So then that is an issue of real concern which we need to look at as Africans. Secondly, I think Zawadi also spoke about this issue of, and I also, I think, mentioned it earlier. I think investors are also reluctant to put their money in African airlines because of the risk factor. So then this really needs to be addressed. How do we make African carriers more investor? How can we package them in ways that then attract investments? Because in this story of old fleets, running very old aircraft, companies that lease aircraft are reluctant to lease the aircraft to African carriers because of the risk factor. It's just the same as money. When we want to borrow money, we have these agencies that vet. Many of them are international agencies that vet African countries before money is given to them. So the people who lease aircrafts are concerned about the African risks. Then therefore, we need to think about how do we package African airlines in ways that then can attract investments. For example, I think Kenya Airways is looking for investors, and I think it is work in progress. So maybe it would be interesting to find out what has Kenya Airways, which has been loss-making really, done to attract investment, who's putting his money or her money in that carrier, and what sort of returns do they expect in an enterprise that has really been loss-making. So these are real concerns. You know, the idea that we make policies and then fail again to implement those same policies. The continuing problem of risk, you know, the perception of risk, whether we are borrowing money, whether we want some investors to come into you know, enterprises like our own national airlines, this issue also needs to be addressed.
Yeah, let me just mention something about what Douglas has said. When you talk about poor air connectivity, and you mentioned, and I think this is also according to IATA, that only 19% of African countries provide for direct flights. Now, what that really means is it makes it impossible for cargo to move quicker, or for businesses to be able to transact quickly, or even tourism to happen quickly. And that explains why a lot of exports from Africa are destined for the West. Africa will export most of its products to Europe and to America, to Asia, and everywhere else except intra-Africa because of these challenges. Because imagine if you're supposed to move a cargo to Morocco and you need to have 3 stops before you get to Morocco. And then we talked about the taxes. The issue about taxes goes beyond just the taxation that we mentioned. It's a good thing that the International Civil Aviation Organization does not require, or requires that fuel, which represents about 25% of African airlines' operational costs, should not be taxed. However, we do have other specific charges. For example, if you are moving a passenger within West Africa, there's a charge that is applied to those passengers. In West Africa and Central Africa, it's an average of $90. And North Africa is the cheapest, with about $27, $30 on the flight ticket. So imagine, and this is very practical, because earlier this year, a friend of mine flew from Nairobi to Accra, and they paid about $500 to get to Accra. And then while they were in Accra, they thought, why don't we go for New Year's in Abidjan, which is just next door? Do you know how much that flight cost? $400. So a distance that you will fly for less than 1 hour costs you $400, while you've come 6 hours from Nairobi at $500. So that really tells you how expensive passenger transfers are. And these are charges that are now put on those air tickets. And that's why, like Douglas has said, the best solution will be for regional carriers, have carriers that come together to try and cover the region. There was an initiative during or just after COVID-19 by Kenya Airways and South African Airlines to form what was called the Pan-African Airlines. I'm not sure how far that went, but that is an example of how better African airlines can actually try to come together strategically and be able to beat the issues around cost and also the issues about connectivity.
Actually, Zawadi, interesting that you're mentioning regional airlines. I suspect, I may be wrong, but I suspect that this whole African airline industry went through some golden decade. I can't remember which decade is that. It could be in the 1970s, because during that time, the East African region actually had a common air transport system, common rail transport system, common lake transport system. So we had East African Airways, which was a regional airline. and we had East African Railways and harbors, which joined the entire East African community. Then I think there was also Air Afrique. I don't know when it disappeared, when it fell out of the sky, but Air Afrique was for the West African region, you know, the French-speaking countries. So it's sometimes, I just wonder, sometimes we make many steps forward and just as many steps backwards when you look at this airline industry development.
But Douglas,
yes.
I mentioned the issue about political will.
Yeah.
If you look at the politics of Africa, it's built around personalities and not national interests for the most part. That is why when you have certain regimes at a particular time, things seem to move in a particular direction. And when those regimes leave, and then another regime will come with a completely new and different interests. So then, yes, and then it becomes very difficult for regional cooperation. As we speak, Africa Union is struggling to get every member state to pay their dues. We have at least 13 African nations that have not paid their membership fees, and another five, making them 18 now, have just paid partially. In East Africa, the president of Kenya, who is the chair of the East African community at the moment, has called for an emergency meeting on the 7th of March to discuss membership payment, because all member states, all the 8 member states of the East African community, except Tanzania and Kenya, have not paid their annual fees, and they're running in arrears of over $90 million. So if you cannot commit to such initiatives that make your East African judicial services work, or East African Legislative Assembly work, how then do you partner on a project so significant like air travel?
Let me bring another appendix to this discussion, still related to this. So the Talk Africa show over the weekend, you had 2 guests. So we had Sean Mendes, who is an aviation expert, and we also had Aaron Munetsi, who is the CEO, Airlines Association of Southern Africa. And Sean said something interesting, and I just want us to listen in to what he said, and then we can pick it up from there. This is what he said.
You know, a number of African airlines today, and especially the national carriers, tend to define success as running half-empty, wide-body planes to London, to Paris, and to Dubai, as long as they are painted in the national colors. And people view this as some sort of great success, no matter the fact that it's losing hundreds of millions of dollars, which the taxpayer then has to bail out.
An interesting take from Sean there, an interesting take. A lot of African airlines just want to be seen to be going to London. They just want to be seen to be going into Washington, into Paris. But does it make economic sense, financial sense for these airlines?
My point, absolutely. You see, this is what I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion. The whole point about national carriers, the whole point about comparative advantage. The idea that in a globalized world, there are people who do other things better and others also do other things better, that probably it might be more profitable to just stay and do what you can do best. However, I think there are also reasons why, for example, countries must have national carriers, even if they are flying half empty, like Sean says. So I see the infrastructure argument, and the infrastructure argument is that airlines, airports, for national governments, for African governments, just like European governments and other governments worldwide, are just like infrastructure, you know. So a country has a duty if it borders the sea to build ports. A country has a duty to build roads, to build bridges, you know, to build railways. So in the infrastructure sense, and that's the argument those who believe in that theory make, that Africans just have to have national airlines. But there is also the tourism multiplier effect, you see, and the ET is a big example to give here. You know, the idea that, and I think even when Kenya Airways was at its prime, our tourism figures were higher. Airlines have a multiplier effect on tourism, and then therefore they make business sense for national governments to run national carriers. Then there is also the thing about currency. I understand from experts like business journalists like Zawadi that the moment you pay for ET, for example, in dollars or Emirates or Etihad, that currency promptly leaves the country. So it's some sort of, a capital flight for countries. So, however, if you pay to travel in your own national airline, then that money stays in the country. So these are some of the arguments they make for having national carriers, even if they are flying half empty, like Sean says. And this is not just being sentimental. I also understand that in times of emergency, say Kenyans in Ukraine, a war has broken out, and you need to repatriate your nationals. So what do you use to bring them back home? I think it's more it's more pragmatic, sometimes to have these carriers, because you may have just to bring back your citizens using your own national airlines in times of crisis like that. So while they may be flying half empty, they sometimes make a political, if not a sentimental sense.
I get the sense Zawadi has a lot to say on this.
So let's talk about the issue about the pride. And it's really about pride to try and get your airline and your brand all over the world. I believe that what is really required is a reset, where then you look at cost reduction, look at also, prioritize what I would call commercial discipline. Does it make economic sense to run an airline? Because why would you expend national coffers for a project that is not adding value? And that ties into an issue around what makes flying very expensive, particularly in Africa, the issue around blocked funds, which are really revenues earned by commercial aircraft or cargo airlines in local currency that cannot be repatriated or cannot be converted to US dollars because of forex challenges in a particular country. And we've seen this happen real time. I think in 2020 is when what used to be a regional carrier, Jetlink from Nairobi, operated particularly the Nairobi-Juba line, had to shut its operations completely. And the reason is it was owed over $4 billion by the government of South Sudan, and they could not convert that money back into dollars because of forex challenges. So this is very significant. IATA data, or the International Air Travel Association data, does indicate that there are at least 1.2 billion US dollars in blocked funds around the world. Over $950 million of those funds are owned by African airlines. Algeria, I think, has the biggest chunk of that. Now, what this does to airlines is, when you know you cannot get back your money, though you've earned it from a particular nation in, say, a month, it will prompt you in subsequent flights to charge expensively, because you're trying to recover that money. You're trying to make sure that when you're paid, you have enough to cover that downtime when you do not have your funds. And that is part of the reason why African tickets are very expensive. You will pay very expensively. You will walk into the aircraft and you wonder if this is a service that actually paid out of my nose from. It is extremely disappointing to pay a premium cost for a low budget treatment, for lack of a better word. So it's really something that has to change. But then, in addressing the issue about blocked funds, blocked funds all boil down to the forex reserves of a country. Those forex reserves can only be built up if there is adequate business, if there is adequate trade, if there is adequate foreign exchange or remittance into the country. And you can only do that if you're making sure that you are sorting out the single air travel issue. That will help you to be able to do business more intra-Africa, and you'll earn money quicker and faster, and you'll have enough forex to be able to sort out these obligations.
There's just something, Dagi, before I let you go on that, just to expand on what he's trying to say, because you're bringing in a very interesting topic as well. But then I think the discussion is also going to veer away from the negatives and also, try to look at some of the positives. And that data that you are pointing out to, I think the latest report that was issued by IATA also had some positives of the potential of aviation in Africa. And you look at Africa having quite a good population. And that, for some reason, we have failed to translate that into a business opportunity. But then, considering this continent's population, we have the potential, of course, to do so much better. But from this discussion, I get the understanding now that population alone is not enough to translate into industry growth. And this is just with regard now to the African airlines. So what is this market not telling us, and how can we then address it, Zawadi?
I think I'll speak to one thing, and that is what I'll call intra-Africa market competitiveness. Data shows that over 75% of travel within the continent is done using international carriers. These are airlines that are not domiciled within the continent. So that means that a lot of the time, when you're flying across the continent, you're using the Qatar airline, Etihad, or Fly Emirates, and you're not using local airlines. So that provides an opportunity for African carriers to be able to price their services differently, make them more attractive and competitive, so that then you are able to attract African travelers. There's no point for someone coming from Europe, they land in, say, Ghana, they want to fly to Nairobi, and instead of using Kenya Airways or using Rwanda Air or using Ethiopian Airlines, they are going to fly Emirates or Qatar Airways. So there's also an opportunity in terms of market competitiveness that needs to be addressed. There's also, I would say, the other issue that needs to be addressed is the issue about the opportunity that exists in terms of global air traffic. If you have about 3% of the global air traffic accounted to Africa, then it means flying is a reserve of the wealthy on the continent. It should not be. And that's why we've seen different carriers have budget airlines or low-cost domestic airlines or regional airlines. That should be translated all around the continent. And I think that there is an opportunity for regional economic communities, whether it is East African Community or the ECOWAS or the South African Development Corporation or Community, to look into air travel or air travel restrictions and issues around how they govern air traffic. Look at the policies, try to harmonize policies within a region. It will be easier if the ECOWAS tries to sort its air travel issues. East African Community sorts its issues, the SADC sorts its issues, and then those blocks to now find a linkage or a point of cooperation. It's difficult if we are to assume that the African Union will be able to do this. They've tried it since 2018 through the Single African Air Travel Initiative. It has not worked. So then why don't we look at regional bodies? We've seen it work in Europe, the Schengen, for example. They even have a single Schengen visa that will take you across all member states except Britain in Europe. Why can't we do that and have an East African Community visa? If you have that visa, you can go to Uganda, you can go to Rwanda, you can go to Kenya, or you can go to the Democratic Republic of Congo or Burundi, anywhere, without needing to apply for a visa again. Those are some of the initiatives I think authorities need to look into.
And Douglas, I'm sure you've also had these kind of conversations going on for
Yeah, quite a bit. Yeah. First of all, I think Mudibo has captured it very well in terms of travel. How do we make air travel affordable? And I think it's tied so much to economic growth because in a sense, some of the data show that when the GDP figures begin to look good, then this translates into, disposable incomes for many ordinary Africans. Now, in order to buy an air ticket, you need disposable income. You must have some money in your pocket. So that's one. So for these figures, they may look good, like 1.2 billion people, 1.3 billion people. But if there are 1.3 billion people, half of which are below below the UN, daily figure of about $100, then that disposable income isn't there. So I think it's really up to governments to create an environment where investments thrive, where investments prosper, where investments can create jobs, then people do have disposable incomes. So I think that's one very important thing. And of course, we don't want also to look at Africa as a country. I think in some countries this is already happening, but a lot more of Africa isn't on the same page. Of course, the idea of then being able to travel is also very important, but as Zawadi has very able to put it, we still have these restrictions. The Schengen idea means just one visa for a very large region. Look at the East African region as it is today. We have not just the initial founders, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, but we have Burundi, Rwanda, DR Congo, we have Somalia, we have South Sudan. This is a very big region that should even have its own airline. If we move away from the sentimental idea of a national carrier, we can now, I think, afford a regional carrier. But of course, we have these petty political undercurrents that continue to divide us, even as we seek to unite. So the idea that you can wake up in the morning in Nairobi and plan a meeting in Kigali in the afternoon freely, it's a very important thing. And that is the direction where now this whole idea of air travel makes sense. In the more developed parts of Europe, some people don't live in countries where they work. Traveling is very routine, arriving somewhere in the morning, doing what you have to do, going back home in the evening. These things are possible in Africa with the necessary economic growth that puts money in people's pockets, with the necessary facilitation in terms of how open are our skies, how open are our borders. Do we continue to erect barriers that on the one hand we aspire to be having open skies, a common market for air travel, but on the other hand we are erecting non-tariff barriers everywhere that then undermines some of these goals and ideas that we have. But I think every time you look at the African terrain, you keep seeing progress, which then, keeps giving us, all of us, hope, in terms of the future.
Now, I just want to also, remember I mentioned earlier on that we also had Aaron Munetsi, who is the CEO, Airlines Association of Southern Africa, on the Talk Africa show that was aired over the weekend. I just want us also to take a listen into what he said, also just dovetailing into this particular part of the discussion. And this is how he put it.
These global airlines, I can assure you, when you go deeper, you'll find that quite a number of them make quite a lot of money and profit from the African continent. And like my colleague Sean pointed out earlier on, the premium for operating an airline in those environments is substantially lower than in Africa. So even if you take the same customer paying exactly the same fee to a non-African airline, that non-African airline automatically starts making more money than their African airline counterpart.
That's an interesting take. He says, as a Kenyan, if I pay the exact same amount of fee that someone probably in London pays, if I pay to Kenya Airways and someone from London pays probably to British Airways from this same fee makes much more than what Kenya Airways will make from that fee. So how then do we address this? Because now there are a lot of all these things that are happening, the taxes that we were mentioning earlier, the operating costs that we were mentioning earlier. There's also the aspect of, most of the things that are required in the aviation sector are not manufactured here in Africa. So all of them have to be imported from somewhere else. How then does Africa find a balance to be able to now compete? Because if we continue this way, I foresee a point where now, of course, it will be difficult to compete with all these other people that, of course, even if they charge the same fee that the African airlines are charging, they are still making more money than the African airlines. Where do we find that balance, Douglas?
I think it's pretty obvious, Jerry, that some of the models and approaches we are using are simply not working. Because Mudibo here, being a journalist, a business journalist, will tell you about economies of scale. If the idea of economies of scale is to be realized, then I think the model of going regional, for me, and this is really just my view, the model of going regional in terms of our thinking, whether it is in terms of owning a carrier, why don't we go back to the old model of East African Airways, which brought the three East African countries at the time together. Now we are more. And I think this can then cut down costs in terms of contributions by individual countries to that same cost. Now, also looking at the region in terms of the population, if it was possible for the people who live in this region to fly these budget airlines on a regular basis, whether it is within country or across the border. Like the Juba-Nairobi route, which Mudibo has just talked about, was a very lucrative route. It was very busy and it was very lucrative. Now, Nairobi-Kigali is becoming an increasingly very lucrative route. So if we look at these things in terms of regions, away from individual nations, then I think we could be flipping the model. Because I think the challenge is the model. But economists will also talk about structural issues, deliberate structural issues that are either erected today or have always been there, since the colonial days, that hinder every attempt by Africans to make any progress in any direction, so that you even talk about the old fleets we were talking about. Why is the risk factor for African airlines so high that manufacturers or those who buy aircraft find it risky to lease to African countries? So these may be structural issues, the risk factor, the perception, which then makes the cost very high. So we need also to address structural issues and maybe think our own models. Countries like Qatar, when you talk airlines and you want to look at the Qatari story of the idea that then created Qatar Airlines in a desert country that had no other resources, it's a model, a unique model. So I think we sometimes try to do things on models that don't work for us. And I think we need to think indigenous ways, indigenous models, more local ways of solving our problems. And I think this goes so much for the airline industry. Yeah, the idea that it is elite, so that you introduce budget airlines. You've already, acknowledged that some people must fly a certain class. And some people, because they can't afford, can only fly a certain class. So that segmenting, that compartmentalizing of the industry itself tells a story on its own. Yeah, it actually acknowledges that some people should not be flying. Yeah, so I think we need to think our own models of doing things.
I agree with you on so many levels on that, Douglas. But I want to put Zawadi on the spot here. Zawadi, you're traveling to London. You have the option of flying Kenya Airways, and you also have the option of flying British Airways. both charging the same price? How do I get to convince you to take Kenya Airways over British Airways? Remember, we have also talked earlier on there about the quality of service that local airlines give to their clients compared to the quality of service that the foreign airlines give to the clientele here within Africa. So how do I convince someone to actually opt for the African airlines?
I believe that the first point of consideration on what airline I'm going to fly is, one, the cost, and then two, previous experience. If I've flown on both airlines before, depending on the experience I had in the past, then I will choose the one that I felt had a better experience. But if I have not flown any, and then the cost will be a key determinant factor on how I fly, or reviews about their services. Those are the key issues that will really determine, because at the end of the day, as a person who's flying, I don't really care about anything else except how much I need to pay, and the guarantee that I'll be able to fly within my scheduled time. We know, without mentioning airlines, there are airlines that habitually have been known to delay flights, to cancel flights, and that doesn't bode well in this kind of market. I have interacted with people who I would say only fly business class, for example, and they will tell you what airline they will never fly, and they will give you reasons about how they felt treated. So sometimes you could pay a premium because of how you are treated and the service that you get. For example, if I've flown business class with airline A 3 times, and I go in for the 4th time, and they can't even acknowledge that I'm a regular person, or maybe I fly with them regularly, and then you have the second airline where you have flown maybe several times also, and they have a system to recognize who is a frequent traveler, and probably there's a way they will treat you. Maybe they'll come and speak to you. They will probably offer you some token of appreciation during a flight, which has nothing to do with your air ticket or the cost of your air ticket. And there's also even the ground, the buses that, ferry. Yes. There's also that experience. So this is a service industry that really has to have its services top notch, because if you don't capitalize on service, you might have a good product and no one will come to you.
And then even that service provision sometimes is tied down to the kind of facilities that are available. And that's now and I know we're running out of time now, but...
Jerry, before you go to the next question, I wish to differ with Zawadi on the question of between British Airways and Kenya Airways, Nairobi, London, which one would I fly? I think as a patriot, I'll fly Kenya Airways.
Purely sentimental.
Of course, you see.
Are you saying I'm not a patriot?
You see where you are leaning. You are leaning towards people who I will not talk about here. Yeah, but also it's also good to be patriotic, and I think some of these people, I'm just trying to picture a Briton who's trying, for example, to fly to Washington and had choices to make. I think they will always go British Airways. So I think as Africans, let's support made home, build home. Buy what you have as a local product. But I agree absolutely with Mudibo on the business aspect of it. Either you deliver in this industry, or you just you shut down.
What are the chances, Douglas, that you get to your destination? Both of you and Mudibo are traveling to the same destination. You get to your destination and you do not come with a complaint to Mudibo.
Well,
what are the chances?
Well, the chances are almost zero. that I'll not come to Mudibo with their of course, you know, there are challenges, and some of the African carriers really, when it comes to issues of, you know, reliability, and I think it's a key factor, and I think that's what the point Mudibo is trying to, value for money. You've put your money in a ticket, a very costly ticket, and then you really get badly let down, you know. Either departure time has been moved 3 times, arrival time where it involves things like connecting flights. It can be very, very inconveniences. You just lost a connection because your airline, your aircraft did not depart in time. So these inconveniences have serious knock-on effects on passengers. And those experiences he's talking about then inform the decisions you make in future in terms of which aircraft do you want to use
and that's what
to fly.
And that's actually what explains why many Africans that fly intra-Africa do actually fly using foreign airlines.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. But then, of course, I've already said we're running out of time. So I just want to pick your brains very briefly. So, of course, we see a lot of facilities coming up now across the continent. You see Ethiopia even coming up with a new airport that is going to be the biggest on the continent. We recently saw Angola launching a new airport. Of course, now they are gradually transferring all operations to the new airport. We also see Rwanda with its partnership with Qatar Airways building a new facility somewhere just off Kigali. Do you think these are enough to begin sort of a revamp of aviation on the African continent? I'll start with you, Zawadi.
I was looking at Douglas. This is a step in the right direction, and that's what I talked about, issues around offering premium services, offering very good service, attractive service, and you need facilities for that. For example, if Kenya is trying to become a regional air hub, then it needs to modernize its airport. It needs to make sure there are no leakages on the roofs, on the baggage area, for example. It needs to make sure that there is good coordination from, workers within the airport, and there's good security within the airport. All these are standards that are international standards. So there's already a standard that is set that everyone needs to aspire to. However, whether or not this is going to really translate into meaningful business really depends on very key issues, and in most times those issues have nothing to do with the aviation sector. And I'm tempted to look back at what the African Union once talked about, called the African Union Protocol on Free Movement of Persons. So I'll just highlight what that is. So it's really about, it's a flagship project, still also under the African Union Agenda 2063, and it aims to remove restrictions on Africans and the ability to travel, work, and live on the African continent. And the aspiration is to make sure that there is right of entry, right of residence, and the right of establishment. So you can enter any jurisdiction, any country within the continent without much restriction. Now, what is surprising is the protocol, the initial focus, or the right of entry relating to visa short stays. We only had Mali, Niger, Rwanda, and Sao Tome and Principe that had ratified the protocol, notwithstanding that 32 countries on the continent had signed it. So imagine you only have 4 countries that are ratifying a protocol that is supposed to revolutionize how people move and travel within the continent and even do business. And that falls short of the requirement that at least 15 ratifications are required for it to come to force. And that again is the issue about too much suspicion within the political leadership of Africa, for lack of a better word, because if this is an initiative of the African Union, all member states are represented in those preliminary discussions. You've gone through all the issues until you've agreed this is a policy we are adopting. And then you stop at, signing or ratifying it. Then what does that tell you? how do we then get to free or single air travel market for Africa, which will be cheaper? How do we get there if we cannot actualize the protocol on free movement of people?
The undercurrents that you are mentioning, Douglas, even as you wrap up, what's your take on that?
Wrapping up, Jerry, thanks. Just about 3-4 issues. Number one is partnerships. And I think Kenya Airways, like I already said, had a golden age. It can still rediscover itself. It has the potential to rediscover itself. One of the things that undid Kenya Airways was the sort of partnership it entered into. So the way forward is actually partnerships, but good partnerships that benefit both parties in that sort of arrangement. So that's one way to go, partnerships. Two, the Ethiopian model. I've always been very curious about Ethiopian Airlines. Of course, people will say it's heavily subsidized and things like that. But it is now Africa's, and probably even globally, one of the most successful airlines. What is its model? I'd really like to understand that model. It is a model that can be emulated. And one of the things I hear and understand is that it is largely indigenous. That the forces that drive that airline are indigenous forces, which then takes us back to the idea of thinking homegrown. So that's an important model. Now, there is the issue also of protocols. Surely we cannot. It doesn't matter how far ET goes, in terms of growth. That's massive investment in that new airport. It doesn't matter how far Rwanda goes in terms of investments. Until we do all these things Mudibo has talked about, why are we still erecting barriers everywhere, preventing fellow Africans? We are happier opening our borders to foreigners. It's easier for an American or a German to travel anywhere in Africa. And I'm a Kenyan here, and I can't just cross the border to another country. So even as we aspire to grow this industry, we are also, on the other hand, very busy erecting or just refusing to implement, protocols and policies that can then open these borders and these skies. And lastly, let's grow our economies. I think that's the bottom line. For you to fly, you need disposable income. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. You have put it very clearly. I think we could not have gotten better persons to come and break this topic down for us. But even to you, our listeners, just to give you a bigger perspective of the discussion that is aviation in Africa, you need to go to YouTube, search CGTN Africa, and search the Talk Africa show that was aired last weekend, and it is titled, "What is Holding Back Africa's Aviation Industry?" What is holding back Africa's aviation industry? It's a very robust discussion, of course, spearheaded by Beatrice Marshall, and you're going to get a lot of insights from two very well informed analysts that we had on the show. And of course, now that ties down to the discussion that we have had today. Remember, Talk Africa is our talk show that airs from here in Nairobi every Saturday from 17:30 GMT, and you can also catch all those episodes that air on the television. You can catch them online on CGTN Africa's digital platforms, and that is YouTube, Facebook, as well as X, which is formerly Twitter. I think, gentlemen, I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for gracing us with your very knowledgeable insights for this episode. This has been the first episode of Talk Africa Plus. I hope to catch you all next week. Till next time.